Sara Flounders is a long-standing political activist and author. She's based in New York City and is a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the International Action Center. She's author of numerous books, including two in particular that directly relate to our topic today. The first is NATO Expansion, NATO in the Balkans, and the second is Hidden Agenda, US-NATO takeover of Yugoslavia. And considering that the dismemberment of Yugoslavia is very much in the minds of people as the West increases the pressure on China, on Russia, tightens the screws on Russia, I think Sara's remarks would be very much appreciated. Sara, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Radhika, and thank you for this panel, because we need to be clear on what's happening. I want to start by saying this war could end today, if the US would stop pumping billions of dollars of lethal weapons and US advisors into the Ukraine, and would stop actively shelling the 1,200-mile Russian border. This is what's going on. And in the meantime, we are being carpet bombed by the media. So unless we make concrete demands to disband NATO, to denounce NATO as the war machine, and have a coherent explanation of what's happening, we will not have an opposition to this war here in the center of imperialism. We need concrete demands and a real explanation. NATO is encircling Russia with military bases, yes, but also is waging a war in Ukraine right now. They are the instigator and the provocateur. For 8 years, US officials and their military machine have fueled and organized to use Ukraine as a pawn for the war on Russia, have shelled the Russian border for 8 years. This is without a doubt. There's just no mention in the media that it's US NATO weapons that are responsible for 14,000 civilian deaths in East Ukraine and the Donbass region. This is a war on the People's Republic of Donbass and Lugansk. There's no mention of the 20 years of expanding NATO military bases that encircle Russia in Poland, Hungary, Romania, the former Soviet republics on the Baltic Sea. It is the United States that refuses to negotiate. Now, there are endless calls for Russian troops out of Ukraine. How about we raise in a unified way US troops, advisors, US weapons out of Ukraine? We got to acknowledge that they are there now. And that's Biden says it publicly, even in the State of the Union, how many billions of dollars more in weapons will be pumped in. It's not that this is an unknown hidden fact. So I want to urge that we really think more seriously, especially in the US, Britain, and the EU, and Canada, about our slogans. When you hear Russian troops out, followed smaller, undercase, lower, stop NATO expansion, really, then we're becoming an echo chamber for the war machine and for the unanimous voice of US politicians, Democrat and Republican alike, all the corporate media. Now, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but it has become a de facto NATO member for sure. So saying that Russia did not start this war, the US did, is a way of really reversing and understanding what happened. Why is NATO encircling Russia? And is Ukraine so weak? They're backed by the entire NATO military machine. So I think we need to really think how we're explaining this and the slogans we use, where we're going with it. Why is NATO expanding? It's not only doubling in membership. It's not just a geographic surrounding for the future. It's not just will Ukraine be a member of NATO? It's this whole array of lethal weapons, of staged war maneuvers on Russia's border and in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea. That's what's going on. These are the facts on the ground that threaten Russia. More and more weapons being put in place, thousands of US advisors, along with volunteers, fascist volunteers, military contractors, are being pumped into the Ukraine. And they've been there for these 8 years. At the same time, while these weapons are pumped in, who's refusing a no first strike on nuclear weapons? That is, it's the US who refuses to do that. So we're in the first days of a world-threatening crisis. NATO lit the fuse. Let's look at how we can challenge even the propaganda so we don't uncritically accept it. It's said again and again, this is the biggest war since World War II. That's false. Biggest war in Europe since World War II. False. It was 78 days of NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. 78 days, 28,000 bombs hit 480 schools and 14 tanks, 33 hospitals. I was in Yugoslavia during the war, not as a correspondent, in a solidarity delegation. We visited the hospitals, the schools, saw the injuries, massively, intentionally destructive. That was the first step in expanding NATO. Happened throughout the war. And it ended with the US building the biggest base, Camp Bondsteel. How could we forget that? To establish their power. Now, what else does the corporate media want us to forget and that we gotta respond and answer to again and again? There's a war in Syria going on right now. I was in Syria several times during the US bombing, the arming of thousands of mercenary fighters. There were US bombers, US troops, US bases. It's not hidden. It's by proclamation. Democrat and Republican, they have supported this war. Syria demands they leave. Why not address this US invasion of Syria? There's a US-backed war in Yemen going on right now and a US naval blockade of Yemeni ports. There are US troops in AFRICOM just tearing up Africa. They just bombed Somalia, I think Friday. So and then we can't forget 20 years of ruin in Afghanistan and the US NATO troops finally being thrown out. Totally erased from any mention in the media is the 7 months of the bombing of Libya and the long years of war and then occupation of Iraq, more than 1 million dead. Now, the war in Ukraine is a danger of total war, and it is pulling in the world.
One minute, please, Sarah.
Okay, what we need to understand is US imperialism needs war. They continually, massively use war. It's to target Russia, it's to target China. They've planned this war on Russia. It's not a miscalculation. Russia warned again and again that they would defend. They moved the troops daily, they made daily announcements, and now it's on our doorstep. If I could just say a word about the sanctions, because the sanctions are really a further push. Of course, there's 41 countries that can't go along with the sanctions because they're already sanctioned. But it is significant, and the sanctions really are a war crime in every sense, deliberately targeting the civilians. But it is important for us to recognize that India and Pakistan and Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, even Mexico on the US border, Nigeria, South Africa, Turkey, a NATO member, are refusing to go along with the sanctions, even though there's great pressure to comply. So these are the crises and the confrontations that are being set up. And in the meantime, they continue sending the troops, more troops, more troops. We were at an anti-war demonstration yesterday, a few hundred people. We were surrounded, I want to say surrounded by thousands of Ukrainians with signs calling for a no-fly zone. We refused to run, to fold up our rally. We managed to hold a 2-hour rally. That was not easy to do, but it's an exact example of the media situation, the global situation. We are surrounded and saturated with propaganda, and yet if we stand up, if we hold firm, if we refuse to run, and continue to focus on no war, no war, no NATO war, I think we will remain strong and coherent together. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.